welcome back. It's Justine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be talking about how to draw a rose. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here's the rose. Roses can be pretty straightforward. You just kind of do these ever-extending circles. And it's going to descend into the flower itself, right? So the edges will be in highlight, but the middle and wherever these petals are going into will be in shadow. And of course they're red, so I have kind of this off red. I rarely go into this pure red range because it won't translate well for CM1K. So I'm actually going to go ahead and, sorry, my voice didn't quite work there. I'm going to go ahead and decide light source because I can get the middle of the rose pretty easily without having to do a lot of extra sketching. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to have the light source coming from above and to the right. As always, it's above and in front of, not behind or next to. So we're going to get started with that in mind. Which means I'll be putting full pin pressure here, right, as we sort of work around. And the edges of the rose, right, it doesn't have to be, the petals don't have to be perfectly straight, because they aren't in a rose, surprisingly. But, you know, as we come down, right, as I come down like in this middle section, I would fade off as it wraps down. So you're going to have some catching the light, and then you're going to have an area that's kind of faded, like up in here. You know, you're going to have the top of the petal catching the light as it sort of loops over. And I have to do some fixing of these lines after. And then, you know, we'll have this come down just a little bit. And then same thing on this back side. This will come down just a little bit where it's catching that light. But with it from above and to the right, it means that on this side it's going to be going into shadow a lot quicker than on the other side. So we're going to back off our pin pressure as we bring it down over here. Although preferably following the line. Right. So we want this to fade off even over here, but then have it kind of go into that highlight to mimic that light source really kind of kicking in. So if I take off the sketch, you know, you kind of have that middle already fleshing out. All right. Now, same thing over here, right? As you have this come down, you're going to have that fade off. But still catching the light a bit until it does that. And it'll create that same effect. It'll give it that depth that it's going to need. Now roses, you know, they have a ton of petals, especially in the middle, that are kind of going everywhere. So we always want the connector points to be faded. And then you're going to have some amount of highlighting that kicks in at the tops of all of them. But bearing in mind, light source coming from above and to the right, indicating, right, that this, as I mentioned with that other one, on the right side, as it dips down, will be going into shadow a lot quicker than the other side. So backing off that pin pressure and allowing it to fade to black to get that effect, right? When we pull back, you can kind of see it looks like it's dipping down. And that's what we'll want to do for the whole thing. So I tend to find it easier, especially with roses. I won't where it's cutting in, where it's sort of coming down like this, because these edges here are dipping down. But as I bring this up, I strengthen my pin pressure until at the very top of the rose petal, I am putting full pin pressure here along this edge. And we'll go all the way around. Here, backing it off a little bit, and then into full pin pressure. And then from there, sorting out, right, like we're going to have this faded pin pressure down here, where it's kind of dipping down into the black. So that's backed off pin pressure, as the petals are blocking the light from each other. And then over here, certainly where you have the petal with its inside away from the light source. Right, so all of that's faded. Allowing that to blend just a little bit. And then as we come over, extending down, right, how far down that light is hitting. So now we're pushing this down. Putting that nice full pin pressure here. Maybe still a little bit as we're coming up. We want to match what we've already done. Right, and just have a little bit of fading into full pin pressure. You can see as we build it up, and if I need to, I can easily come in here and extend this black further down to make it look more like it's fading gently. So that's just what we're going to do for all of it. I'm going to go along these edges, and where they're connecting into other petals, backing off the pin pressure, but when they're free and clear, putting full pin pressures, we bring it around. And then fading it as we bring it down, right? As we bring it into the petal itself, where it's sort of hidden away, right? Same with this one. So faded into full pin pressure. So that's how it starts off looking, right? Where you're going to have some fade happening over here and a little bit more pin pressure over here. The light source really kicking in as it comes down. So, right, having just a little bit at the bottom. Over here it's allowing some of the black to go through. Not bringing it all the way to the edge of that petal. So I'm allowing the black to get extreme. But by over here, we are going to have a little bit more pin pressure before it goes into shadow on this side, which it would all the way over here. Slight pin pressure. So roses can be nice and easy to do. Don't take a whole lot. Just be mindful of your light source, but that's kind of, true of everything, right? And make sure that all these tips are sort of faded in so it doesn't look like it's this sudden dramatic transition into highlight. And then on this side, if you can't see the bottom as well, I might be running it into an edge more than over here where I'm leaving a little bit of a gap. Right, getting in this shadow here. Having a shadow connecting to a highlight will help. So I don't want a highlight running into a highlight. I want the shadow of the petal as it comes down to be what hits this highlight so that when the highlight hits, it doesn't muddy it up, right? So if once I bring this down, I'm going to have a shadow separating that so it'll clearly look like a separate plane of the petal, which is what you want. Bring that over and fading it out as I get to that edge. The only thing you have to keep in mind as you're drawing a rose, because I've drawn several roses, is to not get yourself confused where you've put lines. I've certainly done that before. When I've sketched it, it's made total sense with the petals, and then as I go to add highlights and shadows, get myself a little confused as to what exactly I was doing. Much better at it now. Let's see, you kind of get that impression. It doesn't have to be, ooh, sorry, my words weren't coming out. Doesn't have to be nice and neat. Again, you don't want a highlight to run into a highlight here. So we're going to want this to run into a shadow, which makes sense for a rose because that is what would be happening, right? I mean, these petals are dipping down into deep recess, so it's doing good so far. The only thing I'm going to fix is this right here. I don't think this quite looks right, so we're just going to add a little bit more fading as we bring it down. Nice and easy. Can still leave a little bit of a gap. See what that does. And you can, push it as far out as you want or not. You kind of have a lot of control here. However far out you want it to go. Because you can get lost in constantly building out these petals. Once you get past this sort of initial and you start really fleshing out the petals here, it can be easy to kind of keep going and pushing it and pushing it. It can also be easy to forget to tie them into each other. Right. So I'm doing the same thing, putting that full pin pressure here, and then as I come to this edge, allowing this to fade off, and just you keep building around that, right? Fading it off and then into full pin pressure on these lines. Again, it doesn't have to be straight. They wouldn't be. Petals are going to have twists and turns and tears and other things in them. That's just sort of the nature of petals. Get that little bit of shadow in before I run it into highlight. And try to follow the shape of the petal, so don't do what I just did. Right, it kind of comes up, so we'll do that. It's easier to add highlight than it is to take away highlight, so I also keep that in mind as I'm drawing. Right, so we have some of this turned a little bit away. Probably going to add a little bit more highlight than currently there, but add a little burst of shadow here. So it won't last for long because the petal is already turning. You have this one who's really turned. So a good chunk of this will be turned. Following that contour. Of course, as we turn it though, as we come over here, that's not going to be true. Still want to be able to kind of fade it into black, so I'm not pushing this all the way down to allow the black some room to breathe. But then you have highlight. And then as this angles up, right, you have this twist that happens that would push it into shadow. I'm going to give a little bit more of a burst though to some of this. So we understand. Yeah, see, I don't want this harsh line to just be by itself, so I'll fade this in a little bit. Especially over here where you have a nice good runway for some splayed out leaves before it goes into shadow. It looks a little weird with all the lines when I do it this way. Okay, and then you're gonna have this guy nice and bright. As long as you stay consistent with what side is getting what, it should look good. You don't want to get confused over where your light source is. Also bearing in mind, right, as the petals are pushing out a bit, they're potentially flattening out a bit. So the more highlight you add to some of this, the more it will look like it's flattening out in the way it's catching the light. See over here, I need to fade this as I bring it over. So again, the base, that's shadow. And you want shadow against the highlight. It's what's going to really help it pop. So pushing that high enough that it's shadow against it. Fade into black if I need to. And we're coming over here where you're going to have a little bit more shadow anyway. And so bring that down. And you can change the angle of how these, I was going to say feathers, petals, of how these petals look. The more I bring, like if I decide on this side to pull in the light, it'll look like the petal itself is sort of draping over. Which I'm gonna do as we go further out, because that would realistically be happening. Right, full pin brusher over here. Making sure that's nice and faded. So doing some mid pin pressure as I meet the shadow with the highlight. And up in here as well. So it's just kind of repeating this over and over again for the petals. It gets, as the petals get bigger, you know, you're doing more and more work. It's easy to get the first little bit, middle of the rose done, because it's such a small area. And then as it gets bigger and bigger, you're having to do more and more. And that's kind of what you're getting. I'm gonna fan this out a little bit though. The edge is a little too harsh for me. As we bring that down. Just adding more lines, not more pin pressure there. Right, so it's doing pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of it. It's just kind of the same thing we're already doing, right? So I'm gonna do the rest of it and I will be right back. Alright, so I'm just fixing out this last little petal and we'll be done with it. So it's just following the same pattern we were doing. The shadow at the base of the petal. As the petals get bigger and further away, you'll notice that I created, you know, here, they're darker because they're going straight into shadow, whereas here the petals are flopping over a little bit more, so they're catching that light. And that's sort of that change, but I am going to make sure, you know, that there's a nice clear, like, light here against these edges, even though they're not as bright as what's going to be up here inevitably, because, you know, you have a very different scenario kind of playing out. I still want that to show up just a little bit more. I'm going to give it a little bit more of a burst. But it's going immediately right into the shadow, so you're not going to get as much of a highlight on these inner ones where they're just sort of dropping down than what you're going to get on some of the outer ones where they're big enough that they're flopping over and catching the light. Right, so as the petals get bigger, they're inevitably, you know, splaying out more, and as they splay out more, they'll catch that light. But, yeah, so. Alright, so that is how you draw a rose. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.